Sean Kidney, CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative here. This is a session on priorities for both transition and recovery. This is the session of the conference, because this whole conference is about green transitions. And what we have today is a session where we've invited Adair Turner to talk to us about the work of the Energy Transitions Commission on transitions. So if you like, this is the lodestone on which everything comes around. We're very privileged to have Adair to join us. He is the chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. He's the previous chair of the Financial Services Authority of the UK, chair of the Pensions Commission, chair of the UK Climate Change Commission. I mean, it goes on and on and on. He was Director General of the Confederation of British Industry for a while. He's a part-time lecturer at the London School of Economics, and he's got an illustrious career in BP, Chase Manhattan, McKinsey's, and others. He's a person who deeply understands both financial markets and climate change. In the last few years, the Energy Transitions Commission has done incredible work in mapping out pathways in a range of sectors. We're going to hear a little bit about that in a minute. And then we're going to have a conversation involving Marisa Drew from Credit Suisse, who's the Global Head of Sustainable Strategy, Advisory and Finance, and the Chief Sustainability Officer of Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse has partnered with Climate Bonds Initiative to launch our credible financing transitions framework, which we published yesterday, which is available in the Wover app that you're all coming through. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Adair to run through his comments. But first, I have to do two bits of housekeeping. One is I have to thank our glorious sponsors. Now, you know, I'm not often in a position to say some of these folks are glorious, but they are, because this conference wouldn't exist without them. And their commitment to pushing forward on the climate and climate finance issue has been fantastic. We've just heard from Yves Perrier, the CEO of Amundi Asset Management, about the nature of their commitment in the previous session. And President Jin of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, who was saying, I'm going to say he was thumping the table with his climate ambitions. But I also want to thank the Luxembourg Green Exchange, the world's first green exchange and the most successful, Credit Suisse, BNP Paribas, JP Morgan, the Index team, HSBC, Refinitiv, and Goldman Sachs for their support, and our other supporter organizations. Without you, this couldn't happen. Secondly, there are a couple of housekeeping issues I just need to address. You will be able to ask questions. You will do it through the app, not through Zoom. There is a Q&A function. There will be people who will try and respond to your questions by text, and we'll pick up a couple to throw in to ask Adair and possibly Marisa, who is, by the way, also a commissioner of the Energy Transitions Commission. She wears many hats. This is being translated simultaneously in 5 languages. You can choose in the app the language. It means that we don't need to ask Adair to talk in Chinese or Japanese, because we've got a fantastic, superb translation team. Everything's being recorded. This will be available afterwards. You'll even be able to listen to it on a podcast when you're out walking later. There is a tweet at the bottom of the screen, a hashtag that you can use. Hashtag CBIConf20. Please use it to spread the message on Twitter, LinkedIn, WeChat, Weibo, everything you can. That's it, Adair. I'm now going over to you. This is the introduction slide. I'm going straight to your first slide.
Okay.
Mr. Turner.
Good. Sean, thank you very much indeed. And it's a pleasure to be addressing people across the world on this crucial issue. As Sean has said, I am the chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, which is a global coalition of about 35 major and also some small companies and banks and asset managers from many sectors of the economy, and from Europe, from America, from India, and from China. We are a global coalition, and we go from a heavy industry, steel and existing oil and gas companies, through to companies which are entirely focused on a new renewable energy technologies of the future. So what I would like to do is to describe what we believe the objectives of climate change action should be, why we are absolutely confident that those objectives can be met, what that implies for the shape of the economy which will emerge, which will be a completely different economy than the one that we operate in the moment, and then talk about the implications for business and the implications for financial institutions. And there I will make the link to this very fine paper on financing credible transitions, which has just been published. And I should say that what I'm going to say today, we will be setting out in a detailed and comprehensive report, which we are publishing next Wednesday, called Making Mission Possible. Now, our members began by debating what should be the climate objective and what does that imply for what we need to do to emissions. We are of the belief that the aim should be to limit global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels. And if that is the objective, then you see on this chart the IPCC's estimates of what that would have to mean to the level of emissions. And of course, there are an infinite number of specific emission paths which are compatible with hitting a limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade. But pretty much all of them imply two things. One, a dramatic decrease, a dramatic fall, something like 50% in emissions by 2030, and two, getting to net zero around mid-century. So we in the ETC believe that the objective should be that all developed economy countries and companies should get to net zero by 2050, with perhaps some of the developing world taking a bit longer, but certainly getting there by 2060. And let me be clear, we mean zero means zero. Not that we get to 2050 and we're still using enormous amounts of fossil fuels, but we're buying some offsets from the reforestation sector, but net zero within the energy and industrial system itself. And if I can move on to the next slide, the good news is that we are absolutely confident that it is technically and economically feasible for the global economy to reach 2050 net zero carbon emissions from the energy and industrial systems without relying on offsets from land use. So let me tell you, first of all, why we're so confident that that is the case, which itself has some very big implications for business. If we can move to the next slide, the most fundamental reason why we're confident is that technological progress is delivering dramatic cost reductions. What this chart shows on the left-hand side is Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates of the levelized cost of producing solar or wind or onshore wind or offshore wind. But on the right-hand side, the latest auction prices that we're seeing. And both of those data sets tell us something remarkable, which is that the cost of producing electricity from solar PV is down about 85 or 90% in 10 years. Onshore wind down about 50 to 70%, offshore wind now collapsing in price. That hasn't just happened, it was encouraged by initial subsidies, but what those initial subsidies for these technologies unleashed is the economy of scale and learning curve effects, which have driven a dramatic cost reduction. I'm going to come back several times to the power of those economy of scale and learning curve effects. But what they create now is an environment in which the cheapest way to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity in most regions of the world, and it will soon be pretty much every region of the world, is renewable electricity. And there is lots of it available. The sun shines down on us each day about 8,000 times as much energy as the entire human, residential, and commercial and industrial use. We only have to capture a tiny proportion of that, and we can have cheap green electricity. Now, of course, that still leaves the still remaining question in renewable electricity systems, which is what do you do when the sun doesn't shine and when the wind doesn't blow? But increasingly too, and if we can move to the next slide, technological solutions to that are emerging. When we're talking about diurnal balance, producing solar PV electricity during the day, still wanting to run your factories or your air conditioners at nights, that diurnal balance can increasingly be dealt with by cheap batteries, because again, this is another technology which has collapsed by 85% in 10 years and is going to keep on falling further. And that means that the diurnal balance problem within electricity systems is increasingly solvable. The seasonal balance problem is a bit trickier, but there are lots of new technologies emerging there, and there are sophisticated forms of demand management emerging there. And when you put it all together, and we will set this out very clearly in our report next week, we are absolutely confident that we can now set out to build electricity systems which are as much as 85% dependent on renewable electricity, variable renewable electricity, wind and solar, and we can make those systems work at costs as low as fossil fuel systems, even once you've allowed for all the backup capacity and storage which you need to make a variable system work. So that is the good news, and it's good news which a lot of us didn't know 10 years ago was going to occur, and it tells us something about how rapidly technologies and costs can transform when business puts scale and learning behind them.
Adair, can I stop you here? Because that is an extraordinary statement you've made for our listeners. An extraordinary statement. I appreciate it's in next week's report, but you're saying, which is fantastic, 85% renewable energy dependent at cost as low as fossil fuels is absolutely achievable. Let's just be clear about that.
Absolutely achievable. And achieve now, it will vary across the world. There are one or two land-constrained countries which are a bit higher. Let's take Japan. And then there are other extremely favorable parts of the world, like Chile or Morocco, where the costs will be way, way below those of a fossil fuel system.
So this is an inflection point in world history then, we're hitting.
I think you've summed it up well there, Sean. This is an inflection point in world history. We are entering an era in which we are going to have electricity available in a completely clean fashion and at an increasingly, over time, cheap. I think by 2050, we will be stunned by how cheap solar electricity in particular will be, because I think it is going to go on going down that path which I saw earlier. And if I could move on to the implication of that, it's that at the absolute core of getting to a zero carbon economy is to electrify as much of the economy as possible while decarbonizing electricity production. And there are many sectors of the economy where electrification, and we can move on to the next slide, is going to be relatively straightforward and is not going to cost us anything. So if we take, on the next slide, please, the cost of battery electric vehicles, already on a total life cycle basis, buying the car and running it, that is cheaper than an internal combustion engine. And that reflects the inherent efficiency advantage of an electric engine. Just remember that whenever you use an internal combustion engine, you take about 70 to 80% of the energy in the petrol and you turn it into completely unwanted heat. Only about 20 to 30%, and only 20% if you drive on brake and accelerator, 30% if you're cautious, only 20 to 30% will end up in what you want, which is kinetic energy to drive the car forward. With an electric engine, 95% ends up being used for what you want. So electric engines are fundamentally more efficient, they're going to win, but the good news is that sometime in the mid-2020s, not only will battery electric vehicles be cheaper on a total life cycle basis, they're actually going to be cheaper to buy up front than an internal combustion engine. And I think almost all of the forecasts for the takeoff of EVs and the decline of internal combustion engines are failing to realize that by the late 2020s, it really won't make sense for anybody to buy an internal combustion engine for a normal passenger car. So we can electrify huge sectors of the economy. But the question is, and let's go to the next slide, what do you do about what we and others have called the hard to abate sectors of the economy, where it's not so straightforward to say, if only we have cheap green electricity, let's electrify them. These are sectors like the industrial sectors, steel, cement, petrochemicals. But the good news, and we set this out in our Mission Possible report 2 years ago, and we'll be providing more detail next week. The good news is that in all these sectors of the economy, there are technological routes to zero carbon. Sometimes they do involve direct electrification of the heat source. Sometimes they involve the use of carbon capture and storage. Sometimes they involve the use of bioenergy. But one particular technology which I want to highlight is hydrogen. The long-term future of how we make steel is very probably to use hydrogen as the reduction agent, the chemical that sucks the oxygen out of the iron ore and leaves us with iron and then steel, to use hydrogen rather than coking coal. That is absolutely possible. So across all these technologies, these sectors, we have ways to zero carbon. And that is also true of the long distance, if we move to the next slide, long distance and heavy duty transport sectors. In trucking, we're sure that the future is electric. It may be battery electric at short distance, hydrogen fuel cell electric at long distance, but it will be an electric engine driving the truck. In both shipping and aviation, there is an increasing and exciting possibility of pure electricity or hybrid hydrogen electricity being used at short and even medium distance. The visionaries in aviation think that we may be able to get to a 100-seater flying 1,000 kilometers in an essentially electric mode. But that's not going to be true of long-distance shipping or long-distance aviation. A container ship leaving Pearl River Delta and coming to Rotterdam is not going to be on batteries, nor is a jumbo jet across the Atlantic. There we are going to want to have new fuels that we use within broadly unchanged engines, but they are available. The answer for shipping, I had no idea 3 years ago I was going to say this, but it is the front runner, is to burn ammonia in shipping engines. And you make ammonia from hydrogen, which you can make zero carbon if you start with zero carbon electricity. As for aviation, the route forward is a jet fuel which comes from a bioenergetic or a synthetic fuel basis. Synthetic fuel, again, builds on hydrogen, that we know how to do that. I've mentioned hydrogen a couple of times, and I want to just on the next slide stress one point, which is that we believe that the costs of producing hydrogen from electrolysis, what's called the green hydrogen route, will probably plummet sometime over the next 10 to 20 years. There are only two determinants of the cost of producing green hydrogen. One is the cost of your electricity, and the cost of green electricity is going to come down. The other is the cost of your electrolyzer equipment, which are currently in the West costs about $850 to $1,000 per kilowatt power input. But there are indications that there are already Chinese manufacturers who know how to produce this stuff at $200 to $300 per kilowatt. And when you put those two together, we are going to see a collapsing cost of hydrogen. Put all this together, and what does it mean on the next slide for the shape of the economy? It means a dramatic move away from fossil fuels and a dramatic move towards electricity used either directly or indirectly. On the left-hand side, you see for 2018, the International Energy Agency's estimate of where we get our final energy from. And we only get about 20% of that from using electricity. Most of it, we are directly using some category of fossil fuels. What we're going through is a revolution where by 2050, those ratios will entirely flip round, and we will end up getting 60, maybe even 70 or more percentage of our final energy in electrical form. But we will also, and this is the pink and the mauve bits on this chart, be using electricity to produce large amounts of hydrogen and ammonia. On the next chart, please. That means an enormous increase in the amount of electricity that the world consumes. Today, the world consumes about 27,000 terawatt hours of electricity per year. We see that having to go to somewhere between 90 and 115,000 terawatt hours, with two scenarios. The two scenarios here or whether we really get serious about energy efficiency, or whether we just try and solve all this problem by just having lots and lots of green electricity. So 4 or 5 times increase, and even in rich developed continents like Europe, we think by 2050, we will have to be, and we should be, using 2 to 3 times as much electricity as we do at the moment. In India, it'll be 6 or 7 or 8 times. We also have, won't show a chart on this, but it will be in a report next week, a dramatic increase in the role of hydrogen, going from today's annual production of about 60 million tons per annum in the world to something like 600 to 800 million tons of hydrogen by 2050. Now, this is a dramatic change in the shape of our economy. Obviously, it therefore means a big change in where industry has to invest and where finance has to support investments. And if we could look at the next chart, we can see IEA estimates of how big that change is. Now, let me clarify one thing. These IEA scenarios are what are called Paris compliant. So they are well below 2 degrees, but they're not necessarily 1.5 degree limit. So the picture here would probably be even more dramatic if we moved to a 1.5 degree centigrade scenario. And we'll present some figures on that next week. But think about it this, at the moment, on average, between 2014 to 18, the world has been investing $1 trillion a year in fossil fuels. We can't switch that off immediately. There will still have to be investment to maintain some existing oil and gas fields for a period of time. But certainly by the 2030s, that investment has at very least got to half. And as I say, if you actually move to a 1.5 degree scenario, fall even more. There's got to be huge extra investment. You can see it going from 640 billion per annum to 1.5 trillion per annum in renewables, nuclear, power networks. And actually, don't forget this, a huge great increase in energy using equipment, in building insulation, in all the ways that we invest to use energy in an efficient fashion. So a huge change in where we have to invest within our economy. Let me then end with some implications for business, non-financial business, on the next chart, and then I'll come to finance. I would say there are at least 5 things for business to think about. 1, make sure you don't get stuck in stranded assets and business models. If you think that being in coal power and coal mining is a sensible thing to be, think again, because you are going to be destroyed by the new economics of renewables. Be very careful about investing in gas distribution assets unless you've got a clear strategy eventually to convert them to hydrogen. Be very careful about the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine is ultimately a dead technology. It's just a matter of when it dies. In competitiveness, the second point I want to make is a particular challenge for people in heavy industry, things like steel in particular, who produce a product which will have to be produced in a zero carbon fashion, where producing it in a zero carbon fashion will be more expensive, where the responsible ones want to do the right thing and head towards zero carbon, but where they will be dead if their competitors do not do the same. And this does create this complicated problem of international competitiveness. The resolution of that is that responsible businesses in those sectors should be urging their governments or the European Union to introduce forceful public policies like carbon prices, but combining them with protection at the border to make sure they're not undercut by countries that are not doing the same. But let's switch to the opportunities. 3 big categories of them. Opportunities in the massive scale of infrastructure investment in renewable energy generation, storage, distribution, transmission, which I showed on the previous chart. Huge investments in energy efficient buildings, both new build and refurbishment. This is a huge extra area of the economy. 4th point, opportunities to ride those collapsing cost and price curves, where scale and learning curve effects produce both dramatic cost reductions, and dramatic increases in scale. These, of course, are businesses you have to know how to operate in this. You've got to say, I'm going to go into batteries, or I'm going to go into electrolysis, or I'm going to go into solar PV. But my business model has to be, I want my volumes to be 5 or 10 times in 5 years' time. But I'm also accepting that my costs are going to have to be a half what they are today, or they're going to be dead. And so you have to either have the skills to ride those curves or find something else to do. And finally, there will be lots of opportunities in completely new business models, sharing and autonomous driving, circularity and recycling, which I haven't talked about, but was a huge opportunity, and in this complicated issue of how you balance electricity and supply and demand when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, with lots and lots of software-based, AI-based opportunities in the grids of the future. But let me finally turn to the implications for finance. Essentially, what financial institutions, and we could be talking here either on the next slide, please, we could either be talking about lenders, banks, lending money, or we can be talking about asset managers managing money on behalf of other people. I think there are two big stories. One, avoid assets that are going to be stranded, and realize a lot of assets will be stranded because you'll not be serving your shareholders or your investors well if you end up investing in stranded assets. And two, fund investment opportunities. And then what's interesting is there are a set of tools that finance can use to measure that, to communicate that they're measuring it, to head in the right direction. They include measuring and disclosing risks of the climate consequences of existing portfolios. They include committing to have portfolios which are compatible with net zero. They include issuing green bonds to support clean investments or transition investments. They include using in your own evaluation and encouraging the businesses in which you invest to use internal carbon prices to think what the implications of those would be ahead of those being actually applicable in the external public world. And fifth, a very important thing I would say, blended finance and public-private cooperations in developing economies. Because the point I didn't make earlier, and I should have 2 slides earlier, is those extra investments that we need to build a zero carbon economy, they're not at all troubling in terms of macroeconomics. The total amount of extra money that we have to build a zero carbon economy, it's only about 1% of GDP. Globally, the global economy invests about 25% of GDP. And at the moment, we have rock bottom real interest rates, indeed negative real interest rates. So there isn't a macroeconomic problem of where is the money going to come from, certainly in developed economies. But what there is in many developing economies is high actual or perceived risk, including political risk, which can increase the cost of capital very significantly above that which applies in the developed market. And we need to find ways around that. Now, all of this on the right-hand side, in order to use those tools to achieve those objectives, requires financial institutions to have clarity on what net zero means. And we believe it should mean net zero. Net means, yes, carbon capture and storage has a right to play, but not relying on a whole load of offsets, certainly once you get to 2050. You need clarity on feasible sectoral pathways. You can't simply say to a steel company today, I'm not going to finance you because you're not zero carbon. They can't magically become zero carbon today, but what you've got to have the knowledge to do is to interface with them to understand what is a credible strategy where at a reasonable pace they will get to net zero by 2050 and make progress over the next 10 years. You need a clear vision of the overall shape of what the future zero carbon economy looks like. Of course, it will depend somewhat on technologies where we don't know how precisely they will develop, but I'd be willing to bet you a big amount of money, but will be 2050 before we settle this, so I hope I'll still be around to settle it. I will be absolutely willing to bet you that it will involve a lot of electricity and a lot of hydrogen. Within this, if I move to the bottom right, there are some easier challenges to deal with. One is the red lines. Nobody should be investing in new coal mines or new coal power plants. These will be stranded assets. They are not needed. We can build all the expansion of electricity systems from renewables or nuclear, I would include nuclear, but from zero carbon sources, and be very, very wary of any involvement in higher cost oil or gas exploration or production. Because in a world, and we see a world in which the total number of million barrels a day of oil in 2050 will have to be more like 15 million barrels than 100 million barrels. The only oil which is going to be competitive there is the lowest cost oil, in particular from Saudi and other low cost bases. So high cost oil or high cost gas is likely to be a pretty crazy investment. But then to end, there are some tricky issues. How do you deal with companies which are involved both in old technologies and new technologies? How do you deal with transitional, partial solutions, things where you can do things which would reduce emissions but are not going to get you all the way down to 2050? Well, I think the good news is that actually this white paper on financing credible transitions, this is precisely the set of issues that it has addressed, these tricky issues about how we deal with this transition to what we know the ultimate aim should be, which is real net zero by 2050, confident that it is technologically and economically possible. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
A tour de force. Adair, thank you very much. I'm enthused, engaged, excited. I don't know about you, Marisa, but this puts out the agenda for us. You must be thrilled to see the slow development of national commitments to 2050 net zero targets and the rumour that Europe may step up its 2030 target to a substantive target in only a few days' time. But of course, that doesn't mean we don't have to do the job yet. So I want to first ask you a couple of questions about the technology aspects, a couple of turnkey things like hydrogen, and then I want to bring Marisa in to talk about the financing and what she's hearing from investors about this investor belief and perception of risk issue that you raise, whether that's turning from the risk of what's going to happen to the risk that you don't get on top of the train and you're moving in the right direction. It's a question, but just a couple of things. You've mentioned hydrogen. We have a whole session tomorrow morning on hydrogen for this very question, but that is a vast scale up, more than 10 times scale up of production. At the moment, it's 98% black or gray hydrogen that's produced, which has to disappear entirely, right?
Yeah.
So tell me, how do we get that shift? What, in terms of your modeling and thinking, what's going to actually be this business of getting it down to cost competitive really quickly?
That is a crucial issue, Sean. And in addition to the report that we're producing next Wednesday, we are producing a report just on hydrogen in January, addressing all of those issues. You're quite right on the key figures. At the moment, something like 60 to 70 million tons of hydrogen is actually produced and sold. There's some others which is, as it were, captive and circular within integrated industrial processes. But think about 60 or 70 as the market sold at the moment, of which 95, maybe 97, 98% is produced by steam methane reforming. You start with methane, CH4, and in that process, you inevitably produce CO2. So you're producing your hydrogen, but you're producing CO2. Only about 3 to 5% is produced by electrolysis. Interestingly, go back to 1945, pretty much all hydrogen was produced from electrolysis. It was produced in Norway. That is why one of the biggest producers of hydrogen at that time was Norsk Hydro, because they had cheap hydroelectricity. It's why Yara, a big fertilizer company, is Norwegian, because it got the hydrogen from Norwegian hydro. You use hydrogen to make ammonia, and then you use that to make fertilizers. But what happened was gas got so cheap that we moved away from electrolysis to steam methane reforming. So crucial point out of that, of course, is there's nothing new about the technology of electrolysis. It's really quite straightforward. Most of you probably did it as a kid with a glass of water, and you took two wires, electric wires, you put them in there, and hydrogen comes off one and oxygen comes off the other. But at the moment, hydrogen electrolysis is a cottage industry. There are only a small number of amounts of these electrolyzers built each year. They're built in very unautomated processes. But what we know from batteries, from solar PV, from wind, is that when you multiply the scale of an industry 10 or 100 times, you produce dramatic cost reductions. Now, there are two ways to produce low or zero carbon hydrogen, one of which people call blue hydrogen. You take that steam methane reforming process and you add carbon capture and storage. You'll never get precisely to zero on that, but you will get to a much lower level of carbon, and we can do that, and we should do some of that. And the big debate which is going on in the hydrogen community is what is and what is going to be the relative costs of blue hydrogen, steam methane reforming plus carbon capture and storage, and green hydrogen, zero carbon hydrogen, made from electrolysis with zero carbon electricity. Our gut feel is that in the long run, green hydrogen wins because the electrolyzers get so cheap and the renewable energy gets so cheap. But with both of these, and this is the final thing I'll say, we have a complicated, what we call the chicken and egg problem, which requires public policy support. In order to get the cost either of blue hydrogen or even more of green hydrogen down to the level where it's economic to be used on scale, we need some certainty of scale commitments by the customers. But of course, the customers don't want to make scale commitments until they're certain that the price has come down. So there is therefore in this area a role for public policy to identify the areas of demand which are likely to be the early demanders for green hydrogen, to encourage that development and to support the development of a mass electrolyzer production industry. And I'm pleased to say that within the European new climate deal and initiatives that have been launched, there is a significant amount of money with specific targets for ramping up the European electrolyzer industry alongside a significant developments which are beginning to occur in China. And we will be addressing all these issues in really excruciating detail by the time that we produce our final report on hydrogen in about January this year.
In fact, for our listeners, tomorrow morning we'll have both one of the companies who's working on these new electrolyzers in China represented, well, by Dr. Chang Wei. He'll be talking about the cost reductions they achieve. And we'll also have Paddy Padmanabhan, who's just signed a $2 billion green hydrogen deal in Saudi, talking about the cost reductions from, as you say, volume procurement. So this is going to be a space to watch. But you said many other things around content. But before we go back to those, I've got a few questions coming through. Marisa, can I bring you in? Because Adair also talked about the financial issues and the need to address it. And two questions. One, the first question about perception of risk. In the past, we've had this sense that these changes are risky, so we should keep away from them before we get it. But I want to ask you is, have we got the inflection point there too? Are investors beginning to realize they don't engage with these new sectors? There is risk that they will lose their shirts. Is that happening yet? You're on mute still, Marisa, sorry. Still working on the technology. Looks like we still have a gap. Mari, we'll come back to you. Hold that question. I'm going back to Adair. Now,
set it up.
So Adair, while we're sorting out these technical problems with mobile phones and Zooms, there's another issue you raised though, another topic you didn't raise. So over the last 5 or 7 years, we've seen an enormous take-up of renewable energy around the world. We've also got a problem though, because at the same time, we've seen an enormous application of air conditioning. And in fact, some people at the OECD suggest that the rate of air conditioning use has gone up commensurate with renewable energy application. How do we deal with that? Is the air conditioning, the building side of it, really going to be able to decouple from renewable energy increase?
The answer is, I think we can solve it, but you're absolutely right to identify air conditioning as a key driver of demand, in particular in the work that we are doing in India, where we are working on how can India get to a zero carbon power system by 2050. When we run scenarios for the increase in electricity demand, air conditioning is a non-trivial part of that increase in demand, and indeed, of course, may become even more so precisely because of climate change. I mean, tragically, in the North Indian plain, each summer, you are now seeing heat waves where the temperature touches 50 degrees centigrade, and 50 degrees centigrade is just not an environment in which human beings can live without air conditioning. So we're in danger of a sort of dangerous circularity there. But we would say there will be air conditioning in the developing and the hotter countries, and we shouldn't try to stop that. That is part of their increase in standard of living. Mm-hmm. I think what we have to recognize then is three things. One, it's good if people use air conditioning in a sensible fashion, if I can call it a non-Singaporean or Texan fashion. Whenever I go to Singapore or to Texas, I take a woolly jumper because I know I'm going to be blasted by air conditioning so cold that I'm going to come back with a cold. There is a way of using air conditioning that gets the temperature down to a nice, workable, coolish temperature, but without making the temperature colder in summer than you'd want to live in winter. Secondly, there are huge opportunities to improve the efficiency of air conditioning systems. And the Rocky Mountain Institute, which are members of the ETC, have what they call a global cooling challenge on at the moment about how can you increase the efficiency. The key measure here is how many kilowatt hours of heat do you suck out of the inside of the house per kilowatt hour of electricity put in. Which is also, by the way, if you have a heat pump, and a heat pump is simply an air conditioner in reverse. When you're running it in reverse, it's how much heat do you get inside for electricity put in. Inefficient ones will already run at 3 or 4, but we can probably take that up to 6 or 7. And that means you can have more of what you want, which is cool temperature with less electricity. But the final thing is, yes, we will need to very significantly increase the electricity supply. One of the good things about air conditioning is that the big challenge with air conditioning in tropical climates, in hotter climates, tends to be that diurnal balance that I talked about earlier, day to night balance, lots of solar power by day, but still running your air conditioners into the evening. And that is the easier challenge within the supply-demand balance system because batteries are going to come to our rescue. The seasonal challenge is a much bigger challenge in the high latitudes like the UK with winter heating peaks. And it's rather fortunate that in the areas where air conditioning is growing dramatically, we will produce much more renewable electricity with a big focus on solar, and we'll probably use lots of batteries to do the day to night balance. So through those mechanisms, there are solutions to this which do not involve saying to poor people, air conditioning is only for the rich.
Fantastic.
By the way, I would add, I
Marisa.
think I'm back in finally, am I? Got me? I would have to add Florida to your list of places that we must need the woolly jumper. So hopefully we can learn from that. I know you wanted to ask me about finance, Sean, but I also, because I think the world would love to hear more from the wonderful knowledge that Adair can bring to the table in the ETC's work. And I think before we run out of time, I'd really love if you could maybe address, you touched on it briefly in snippets, the developing world. Those of us in the West, we can do everything that we can do to get to net zero. but I think we all recognize if economies like China and India don't get there, the global phenomenon of net zero isn't going to happen. And I think there's some amazing examples, as you pointed out, about the greening of those economies. On the other hand, we're still building coal plants in large-scale fashion in a lot of the developing market. Can you maybe touch on the work of the ETC, why you remain optimistic that we are going to be able to transfer that into more cleaner sources, and how you're getting involved? Maybe some high points there I think would be pretty helpful.
Well, look, I think China, we have a team working in China with whom I'm in regular contact. If this had been a non-COVID year, I'd have probably spent about 6 weeks out in China with them, engaging with Chinese businesses. It's had to be by video during this year. We have an excellent team based in Beijing. And we have set out a report which we have launched into the Chinese policy debate, arguing that China could be a zero carbon economy by 2050. We've entitled that report, China 2050, a fully developed, rich, zero carbon economy. We think that that is absolutely credible. We are now working intensely on the next 5 to 10 years. And we're really at a crucial point in China. They have made enormous progress on the development of renewables. For instance, this year, China will probably agree about 58, 59 gigawatts of new solar development. That is by far the biggest solar development in the world. We are also seeing that on solar, certainly, and wind, it's beginning to get close. The costs are now falling below what's called the coal benchmark price, so that they will no longer need subsidies to drive it forward. On the other hand, despite that progress, they are continuing to build new coal-fired power stations. And the challenge is to work out why that is the case. And as is often the case with human behavior, it's embedded in all sorts of complicated intellectual inertias and incentives. Provinces which would rather build a more expensive coal-fired power station than import wind and solar from the province next door, because if they build it themselves, it counts as part of provincial GDP, and either actually or they perceive that they are rewarded for this. I mean, most businesses can probably recognize this as the problem of when you get your incentive structure inside a business wrong, you can have people doing harmful things. There are also these details there. So we are working very intensely in China with the objective of being to work with the people who are arguing in China that they don't need any more new coal, that all the expansion of renewable, of the electricity system could come from renewables or nuclear. They have a major nuclear plant program that is absolutely doable. It requires a pace of development of about 50 gigawatts of wind and 50 gigawatts of solar a year. On solar, they're actually going slightly higher. On wind, they're a bit slower. And a crucial turning point is the 14th five-year plan, which will be agreed over the next 6 months or so. And a crucial area is to encourage the Chinese to be bold in their commitments there. In other sectors of the economy, for instance, in batteries, in electrolysis equipment, we've talked about that, and you have one of these companies talking tomorrow. In electric vehicles, of course, they are real leaders in the world. India, somewhat similar. In India, we are seeing dramatically low prices for solar. We're also seeing very interesting new contracts of solar plus batteries beating coal in auctions. There again, we are absolutely confident that India could take variable renewable supply from 8% of the electricity supply now to 35% by 2030, en route to being zero carbon by 2050. And there are, like in all developing countries, there are good signs and bad signs. On the one hand, Premier Modi has made some very strong commitments, for instance, to 450 gigawatts of renewable power capacity in place by 2030. On the other hand, they just opened coal mining to private sector investment in a way which I think really surprised people, and I don't think makes much sense. So we are at a crucial stage. This is a crucial stage for people to engage with Chinese friends, Chinese counterparties, Indian friends, Indian counterparties. It will also be a crucial area of debate between the UK as the president of COP26 next year, and the Chinese and Indians next year. Final thing to say on developing economies, draw a distinction between those which already have significant power systems which are 60 or 70% coal-based. That is true of both the Chinese and the Indians. And there we've got to have a strategy of all the new growth should come from zero carbon, and then in the 2030s and 40s, get rid of the existing coal. Africa is different. Africa, when you get away from North Africa and South Africa, really has such low electricity use that it's almost a greenfield site. And the challenge in Africa is the mobilization of capital to get it right first time. There is enormous amounts of wind, enormous amounts of solar, enormous amounts of hydro. The way forward to Africa should be dramatic increases in electricity supply, none of which has to be provided by coal. And so that is a very important challenge, but a slightly different challenge from India and China, where we start with very significant systems.
Fantastic, Adair. Thank you, Marisa, for directing. We're in our last few minutes of this, would you believe? In a tour de force, as I've said before. We're going to make this available as a podcast and everything. And by the way, we will want to broadcast your launch next week of the report as well. Folks listening to this, if you want to get a sense of why this transition paper that we've done with Credit Suisse is so important, it's because we want to build on the work of the Energy Transitions Commission and turn this into a set of financial products to make it easy for investors to invest in a future that is lower risk, that is safer, that is part of what we know is going to happen, not part of the past. That's what it is. So Adair, what's the next big challenge for you in getting this across? Is it about new trajectories, granular? Is it about government engagement? What's next?
Well, I think the good news is that there's been a lot of progress over the last 5 years. If you go back to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, people were talking about well below 2 degrees centigrade as the objective, not 1.5. And when businesses said, I'm a responsible business at that stage, they'd say, well, I've got a strategy which is compatible with Paris. But it was all a bit vague and therefore a bit difficult to hold people to account. One of the big things that's happened over the last 5 years is an increasing number of countries and the EU, but also crucially companies and banks and asset managers making commitments that say, what we're really about here is net zero by 2050, and we're committed to doing it. And I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that change, because once we know what the target is, once we're measuring against that, we know in business that what gets measured gets managed. And then people have a clear objective to go for. So we will be hoping in our work, and we're working very closely with the UK COP26 presidency, to be magnifying and increasing the number of countries and the number of companies which are making credible net zero commitments. That's step one, and to spread that across more and more sectors of the economy. But then within that, and I've just actually immediately before this come off a call with the global steel industry, we're working on the nitty-gritty of what then has to happen 5 years by 5 years from now to 2050 to make that possible. When do you have to have the first pilot plants in operation? When do you need to start scaling up? And what level of public support, whether it be public funds to support early technology development, or carbon prices, or fuel duty mandates on shipping or aviation, what is needed as a combined architecture of investments by business and public policy support so that we have a credible path. So we're working both on expanding the number and the strength of the commitments to net zero, and within that, the absolute detail, sector by sector, of how one specifically gets there.
And isn't that a wonderful way to round out, Sean, our 5 principles under our paper? I mean, if we think about the principles that we laid out yesterday and trying to take all the good work that you and others have done in the ETC to put that into some sort of a digestible framework for the institutional capital markets to back. What have we said? 1.5 degree Paris aligned. We have said it's got to be established by science, good quality science and academia. We have said that offsets don't count. We've got to truly get rid of the carbon emitting industries and not just count against bad practice. We've said there's got to be technologically viable pathways, which is exactly what you're helping us lay out and the market is hungry for. And last but not least, the commitments have got to be backed up by hard metrics, operational targets, not just something that is prospective and hopeful. It has to be really, really deeply embedded with the operations of companies. And I think it's just such a wonderful combination of what you've laid out with what our aims are for trying to create a $1 trillion market to finance this net zero objective.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
We've had a few questions about taxonomy, and it's worth noting that the Energy Transitions Commission work was highly influential in the thinking behind the European taxonomy.
Yes,
so if you want to look at connecting the dots, there's a lot of them to connect. Adair, we need to wrap up. I want to give you a final word, but I just want to ask Marisa, have we missed anything like this? We've covered the full territory. You must be so proud as a commissioner to have been associated with this work.
It is, it's wonderful and inspirational every time we have a session, but I think you can see that our interests are completely aligned and philosophically we're all in the same place as well. So my only final comment would be to encourage the audience to look out for Making Mission Possible report, because it is filled with so much of the detail that Adair only was able to touch on in our short session. I think we could go on for hours, but there's a lot there to sink your teeth into. And again, very synergistic, Sean, with what I think we're all trying to accomplish with the framework as well.
So for all our listeners, again, who've been asking, isn't this transition going to be hard? Isn't it going to be hard to figure out what it is? Now you've got your answer. We have the work's being done. We are simply translating that now into guidelines and instruments for the financial sector to make the capital flows easier. So it's not going to be too difficult. But Adair, take us out, leave us with a final thought for all our financiers. We've got about 600 people actually listening through the app and online at the moment, and this will be recorded and played in different time zones. What do you want to say to everyone?
I want to say that for the sake of the climate, and for future generations, we've got to get to net zero by 2050. And that the good news is that that is completely technologically and economically doable. And we should be confident that that's the case. And that what we know is that once you get business to have a clear objective, it can achieve extraordinary things in the mobilization of capital behind new technologies, which end up reducing the costs so much that they're even lower than you thought they would be in the first place. So I think we should be absolutely determined that we get to 2050, but confident that we can. And there is clearly a crucial role for everybody in business and everybody in finance to just reallocate those capital away from the old and towards the new. And I think this new economy, this deeply electrified, cleaner, quieter, more pleasant economy is extremely attractive in itself, even if we didn't have to do it in order to deal with climate change as well. So that's the final thought I would leave you with.
Thank you. For those people who've asked questions on WOVA, we'll be attempting to answer those by text. Have a look, ask more questions, and we will link people up with the Energy Transitions Commissions if that's what you want. The next session in just under half an hour will be about transitions in the fossil fuel sector, coal and gas. Please join us for that in a little while. Tomorrow morning, we'll be having a session on hydrogen and steel, another area that Adair has spoken eloquently about. And then tomorrow afternoon, the final technical session will be on resilient strategies, but we don't mean just adaptation of infrastructure, we mean economic social and ecosystem resilience. All part of it. Adair, thank you so much for making our conference such a fantastic thing with your keynote turnkey presentation today. Marisa, thank you for joining us. Thanks everyone. See you again in about 25 minutes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.